Joe Krolak, and as Ed said, I'm the principal hydraulic engineer at the Federal Highway Administration, and I work in the Office of Bridge Technology in Washington, D.C. Now, those who know me, I'm going to shock you because I'm going to try to make a short presentation without the benefit of PowerPoint slides. So if I occasionally seem to get stuck or falter, please understand because I'm trying to overcome 25 years of indoctrination. On behalf of the Secretary of Transportation, Ray LaHood, our Administrator, Victor Mendez, and all our colleagues at the U.S. Department of Transportation, I want to express our appreciation of being asked to join you today. Most people, when they think of the Department of Transportation, think of roads and Federal Highway Administration. However, in fact, the U.S. DOT consists of 11 different, what we call modes, who all have differing and stakes in our floodplain, our nation's floodplains and our floodplain practices. For example, the Federal Aviation Administration has a stake in the floodplain interactions with airports. A lot of our airports around the country are built in areas in which we consider floodplains. Is that a good practice? Well, they're there. They're probably not going to move. So how do we basically better coordinate and integrate good floodplain management practices with these airports, especially when we see plans to expand some of the air transportation? The Federal Transit Administration, again, mostly responsible for public transportation alignments, but once again, there is interaction between floodplain and floodplain values and some of the issues of trying to increase and encourage public transportation facilities all around the country. The Federal Railroad Administration, similar issues and concerns and opportunities with rail alignment. The Maritime Administration, essentially managing our ports, working with navigable waters with other federal agencies, so there is a real impact in terms of how, for example, climate change impacts may affect what are going to be floodplains and what might affect our ports in the future. And other agencies like St. Lawrence Seaway Commission, which has both international coordination with Canada and the United States on international waters. How's the U.S. Department of Transportation aligned with floodplain management and floodplain management policies and programs? Well, some may disagree with us because it doesn't always come out as being there, but we all are governed by the Executive Order of 1977, Executive Order 11988. Additionally, in 1979, the department issued an order which essentially not only incorporated the executive order, but actually added some additional directives and requirements to better align us with another issue that we have to deal with, which is the NEPA. So we wanted to make sure that we're incorporating the NEPA process within our floodplain program. And each agency that has some type of floodplain impact has their own regulations. Since 1979, Federal Highways had a regulation in 23 CFR 650, subpart A, called Location and Hydraulic Design of Encroachments and Floodplains. Now, for the hydraulic engineers in the transportation community, this idea of having good floodplain management was not exactly a new concept. In 1945, Carl Izzard, who was our senior hydraulic engineer of what then was the Public Roads Administration, wrote, "Drainage of highways is frequently handled by standardized treatment with too little consideration to peak rates of runoff." He also goes on in saying, "The highway engineer should consider that he is responsible for the whole effect of the highway improvement on the surrounding countryside. And that is his duty to avoid actions which unnecessarily damage property abutting the highway." If you think about it, back in 1945, that's not totally misaligned with some of the Gilbert Smith principles that we all really appreciate and use in floodplain management today. Now, maybe folks at the rest of the engineers at Federal Highway didn't listen to Mr. Izzard, but we've tried to incorporate them into the hydraulic side of things. Now, before I move on, I'm going to do a slight digression. and describe how federal highway and a lot of the transportation agencies work. We may appear monolithic to everyone. Essentially, folks outside the highway community, we might seem one organization with the sole purpose of paving every acre of land out there. And that may unfortunately have some merit. However, basically a lot of what is federal highway is not necessarily in our control. Each entity involved in highways, which includes Congress, has varying degrees of control over our roadway policies, designs, and specifications. In reality, federal highway and a lot of the DOT nodes have less control over our highway projects than other federal agencies may exercise in their programs and oversight. So we may have less ability to essentially mandate or to say this federal aid dollar should not be used for this project because it has adverse impacts to the floodplain, because there may be other interests that essentially we have to balance against. Floodplains is one of those areas. So getting back to how the federal highway program works, our annual federal aid budget is $42 billion. Most of that, though, goes to state governments, and from that gets passed on typically to local folks as well. So that $42 billion is being parceled up and portioned out to different state DOTs, and then they're passing down for local projects. You can see how the ability to have oversight on something as critical as floodplain policy becomes more difficult as we have less direct oversight of those funds and the way they're spent. The other issue that we find ourselves into is transportation essentially is becoming an increasingly interconnected network that allows and governs the movement of people, goods, and services across the country. So that's the mission of the transportation community. And we have this network, this interconnected network, that stretches across wider boundaries than those that may be associated with political or physical borders, such as a watershed. Therefore, we find ourselves in a quandary. We have to essentially, as a transportation community, balance our traditional highway objectives, essentially traveling from point A to point B, having open and ability to go from an airport to an airport. Those objectives have to be balanced with the equally compelling objectives of the interests located between those 2 points. For example, preserving a neighborhood or not adversely impacting the floodplain. And a lot of our big projects, those are what we run into as impediments to making the floodplain management and all these other things balance. For example, do we have a site, for example, that we have a poor, economically distressed community, and if we put a roadway through there, we're going to be breaking up families and neighborhoods, versus an alignment of a roadway or other transportation facility within a floodplain? They're both equally compelling requirements. We need to essentially have some goods and services. How do we resolve that? Kind of as a side, I often say that if you think of federal highway and you think of the transportation community, think of the solar system. Maybe the planet Jupiter's pavements. Maybe if we're lucky, the NEPA process is lovely planet Earth. Maybe the lawyers are, I don't know, Neptune or something like that, pretty big planet. And the asteroids are safety. For good or bad, the hydraulics programs at the transportation agencies with all these different large bodies, planetary bodies, would probably more accurately described as planet Pluto. So we're hydraulics way out there in the periphery, and what's even worse, the astronomers don't even recognize us as a planet anymore. So it makes it very difficult for us to administer the program, given all these different priorities, these different balances, and it makes my job because all that pavement's pretty heavy.